This was the most brutal way a feared ruler ever met his end, and history barely talks about it. Vlad the Impaler. Just the name makes people uncomfortable. He wasn't just cruel, he turned cruelty into a message, a weapon, a language that entire armies understood without a single word. But here's what most people don't know. His final moments weren't just a death. They were something darker, something that tells you everything about who he really was, and what his enemies thought of him even after he was gone. What happened to his body after that last battle? That's where the real story is. To understand what happened at the end, you have to understand what Vlad built his entire life around. He grew up as a hostage. As a child, his own father handed him over to the Ottoman Empire, a political move to keep the peace. He lived under their control for years, watched how power worked, watched how fear worked, and somewhere in that time, something in him changed. When he came back to rule Wallachia, a small region caught between the Ottomans and the Hungarians, he didn't come back soft. He came back with a very specific idea of how to hold power. Impalement wasn't random. It was calculated. He used it on enemies, on thieves, on corrupt officials, on anyone he felt threatened his grip on the region. There are accounts of thousands of bodies on stakes outside his own capital. Not hidden, displayed. That was the point. Ottoman commanders who came to negotiate with him once turned back after seeing the fields outside his border. They didn't even attempt the meeting. This was a man who understood psychological warfare before anyone had a name for it. But power like that doesn't last. It attracts enemies the same way it repels them. By 1476, Vlad was fighting for his throne again, for what would turn out to be the last time. His enemies were closing in, and no one around him knew this campaign would be his last. By late 1476, Vlad had reclaimed his throne, but it was already shaking beneath him. He had backing from Moldavian forces and Hungarian support, but that support had limits. The Ottomans weren't done. They pushed back hard, and Vlad's coalition was thinner than it looked on paper. He moved his forces into Wallachia, knowing the odds weren't in his favor. He'd been in worse situations before and come out standing. That was probably what he told himself. But this time was different. His troops were outnumbered. The Ottoman forces pressing into the region weren't just soldiers. They were a message. Take him out, and the resistance in Wallachia dies with him. Everyone on both sides understood that. There are accounts that in the final stretch of the campaign, Vlad's own ranks started fracturing. Loyalties in that region were never guaranteed. Boyars, the local nobles, had betrayed him before. Some historians believe they did it again. He may have gone into that last battle without knowing who around him could still be trusted. That's the part that's hard to sit with. Here was a man who spent his entire reign making examples of traitors, publicly, brutally, and yet, when it mattered most, betrayal may have found him anyway. The battle near Bucharest, the exact location is still debated, didn't last long. His forces collapsed. And somewhere in that chaos, Vlad the Impaler went down. But what happened next is where history gets uncomfortable. Here's what the history books gloss over. Vlad wasn't just killed. His body was taken, decapitated, and his head was sent to Constantinople, to the Ottoman Sultan, displayed as proof, as a trophy. Think about that for a second. This was a man who spent his life using bodies as messages, and in the end, his own body became one. The Ottomans knew exactly what they were doing. They understood his language. They responded to it. His head was reportedly mounted and displayed in public, so that anyone still holding out hope that he'd come back, the way he had before, would see it and know it was over. He'd come back from exile twice before. Twice. So displaying the head wasn't just brutal. It was necessary. From their perspective, they weren't taking chances. And here's the detail that doesn't get talked about enough. His burial site is still not confirmed. There are claims, a monastery in Romania, an island grave, but nothing has been verified. For a man who feared that documented, his final resting place is essentially unknown. He built a legacy on visibility, on being seen, on making sure everyone knew what he was capable of. And in the end, he disappeared. Not with a final stand, Not with some last act of defiance, just gone. Except for a severed head in a foreign city, telling the world the story his enemies wanted told. Here's what stays with you after you learn all of this. Vlad spent his entire life trying to control how people saw him. Every stake, every display, every act of brutality. It was about the image, about making sure fear did the work so he didn't have to fight the same battle twice. And it worked, for a while. But the same logic that built his reputation is what destroyed it at the end. His enemies knew that killing him wasn't enough. They had to kill the idea of him. That's why the head went to Constantinople. That's why the burial site was never confirmed. You don't just defeat a man like that, you erase the myth. And yet here we are, centuries later, still talking about him. That's the part nobody planned for. The monasteries that may hold his remains still stand. Researchers still argue about where he's buried. His name still carries weight in ways that most rulers from that era simply don't. He wanted to be unforgettable, and he got that, just not in the way he intended. We spend so much energy trying to control our legacy, trying to shape how we'll be remembered. And in the end, history decides on its own terms. Vlad the Impaler didn't get a heroic ending. He didn't get a confirmed grave. He got something stranger. He got permanence. So the real question isn't what happened to him. It's what it says about us that we're still this fascinated by him.